The fastest way to destroy your career is to underestimate the one person who refuses to lose. Those were the last words my mentor whispered before opening the conference room doors, and at the time I thought he was talking about the billion-dollar merger waiting on the other side. I was wrong. He was talking about her. The boardroom overlooking downtown Chicago shimmered beneath the early morning sun, its floor-to-ceiling windows reflecting rows of polished glass towers stretching toward Lake Michigan. Every executive was already seated around the massive walnut table, quietly reviewing financial reports while assistants arranged coffee cups and presentation folders with practiced precision. I adjusted the sleeve of my navy blazer, gathered my notes, and reminded myself that I had spent 20 years building a reputation no negotiation had ever broken. At 45, I had become one of the most respected corporate attorneys in the country, because I never confused confidence with emotion. Contracts mattered. Evidence mattered. Winning mattered. Personal feelings stayed outside the boardroom. That philosophy had never failed me until the elevator doors opened at exactly 8:30. Conversations around the room faded almost instantly. A woman stepped inside carrying nothing but a slim leather portfolio, and the unmistakable confidence of someone who never questioned whether she belonged. Shoulder-length dark blonde hair framed a composed face that revealed almost nothing, yet her blue eyes studied every corner of the room with effortless precision. She wore a charcoal business suit tailored perfectly, simple pearl earrings, and the calm expression of someone walking into familiar territory instead of one of the most difficult negotiations in the industry. I recognized her immediately. Madison Brooks. 36 years old. Corporate negotiation specialist. Brilliant. Relentless. Infuriatingly successful. The woman who had quietly dismantled 3 of my largest deals over the previous 5 years without ever raising her voice. She noticed me before taking her seat across the table. A faint smile appeared, polite enough for everyone else to admire yet sharp. Enough for me to recognize as a challenge. "Good morning, Harper," she said smoothly. "It has been a while." "Not long enough," I replied before I could stop myself. A few executives exchanged amused glances while pretending to focus on their documents. Madison simply smiled a little wider. "I was hoping you would say that." The meeting officially began seconds later, as the chief executive officer explained that 2 multinational companies were preparing for a merger valued at nearly $1 billion. Every legal obstacle, financial concern, and regulatory requirement would need to be resolved within 6 weeks. Failure would cost thousands of jobs and years of planning. I listened carefully until one sentence changed everything. "Neither side trusts the other," the chief executive officer said. "Which is exactly why we need our 2 strongest negotiators working together." My attention shifted immediately toward Madison. She looked just as surprised as I felt, though she recovered far more quickly. "Working together?" I asked. The chief executive officer nodded. "You will lead the legal strategy. Madison will direct negotiations. Neither of you can complete this deal alone." A quiet silence settled across the room. Everyone knew our history. We had spent years competing for the same clients, exposing weaknesses in each other's strategies, and leaving every negotiation convinced the other woman was the only opponent worth preparing for. The idea that we would suddenly become partners sounded almost impossible. Madison finally closed her portfolio and looked directly at me. "I suppose we have 2 choices," she said calmly. "We can spend 6 weeks proving why this partnership cannot work, or we can surprise everyone." I met her steady gaze without answering. Somewhere beneath my professional confidence, an unfamiliar feeling appeared. It was not fear. It was the strange certainty that the next 6 weeks were about to change far more than a corporate merger. The meeting ended less than an hour later, but the silence that followed lingered far longer than the discussions themselves. Executives filed out of the boardroom exchanging optimistic predictions about the merger while I remained behind collecting legal briefs I no longer remembered reading. Across the table, Madison organized her notes with the same calm efficiency that had frustrated me for years. She never appeared rushed, never seemed intimidated, and somehow always managed to look completely prepared even when everyone else was scrambling to keep up. As I slipped the final folder into my leather briefcase, she walked toward me without hesitation. "Looks like we are partners," she said with an easy smile. "I would not celebrate too soon," I replied. "Partnership requires trust." She nodded thoughtfully instead of taking offense. Fair point. Then perhaps we should start with respect. Before I could answer, the chief executive officer called both of us into his office. The room overlooked the Chicago River, where morning sunlight reflected across the water between towering office buildings. He waited until the door closed before speaking. I know neither of you asked for this arrangement, he said, folding his hands on the desk. That is exactly why it will work. Madison and I exchanged equally skeptical glances. You have different strengths, he continued. Harper, you anticipate every legal obstacle before it appears. Madison, you understand people better than anyone I have ever hired. Separately, you are exceptional. Together, you might actually save this merger. I appreciated his confidence, though I remained unconvinced. After leaving his office, we walked toward the elevator in complete silence until Madison finally pressed the button and glanced sideways at me. Lunch? She asked unexpectedly. I almost laughed. You are serious? Completely. We have spent 5 years trying to outmaneuver each other. She smiled. Exactly. We already know how to compete. We should probably learn how to have one civil conversation before Monday. Against my better judgment, I accepted. An hour later, we sat across from each other in a quiet restaurant overlooking the river, surrounded by business professionals discussing quarterly reports and market forecasts. The atmosphere was relaxed, but neither of us seemed willing to lower our guard. We spoke almost entirely about the merger, debating negotiation strategies, regulatory concerns, and shareholder expectations. Every opinion I offered was challenged. Every argument she made was supported by thoughtful reasoning I found annoyingly difficult to dismiss. Somewhere between the salads arriving and coffee replacing our water glasses, I noticed something unexpected. Madison never interrupted. She listened carefully before responding, disagreeing without making disagreement feel personal. It was an unfamiliar experience coming from someone I had always considered my greatest professional rival. As we stepped back onto the sidewalk, a cool breeze swept through the city streets while afternoon traffic filled the air with familiar sounds. Madison adjusted the strap of her portfolio before looking toward me. You know, she said quietly, I never disliked you. I stopped walking. That is difficult to believe. She laughed softly. I admired you. The problem was that admiration looks surprisingly similar to competition when two stubborn people refuse to admit it. Before I could process those words, her phone rang. She glanced at the screen, apologized politely, and stepped away to answer the call. I watched her disappear into the crowd of downtown pedestrians, realizing that for the first time in years, I had spent nearly 2 hours with Madison Brooks without trying to defeat her. I told myself it meant nothing. Yet as I headed back toward my office, I found myself replaying our conversation instead of preparing legal arguments, and that unsettled me far more than any negotiation ever had. Monday arrived with the kind of relentless pace that only a major corporate merger could create. By 8 o'clock, every conference room on the 32nd floor had been converted into temporary strategy centers filled with attorneys, financial analysts, compliance specialists, and consultants moving from one meeting to another carrying laptops, legal binders, and endless cups of coffee. I had always enjoyed the controlled intensity of high-stakes negotiations because they rewarded preparation above everything else. Unfortunately, preparation now required working beside the one person who challenged every instinct I had spent decades trusting. Madison appeared precisely on time, carrying the same leather portfolio and wearing another impeccably tailored charcoal business suit. Good morning, she said as she placed a stack of market reports on the conference table. I reviewed the international shareholder concerns before sunrise. I raised an eyebrow. Do you ever sleep? She smiled without looking up. Only after deadlines. Despite myself, I almost laughed. The morning quickly settled into a rhythm that neither of us had expected. I identified legal risks hidden inside hundreds of pages of merger documents while Madison anticipated how executives, investors, and regulators would react long before any meeting actually took place. More than once I caught myself preparing to disagree with her simply because it had become second nature over the years. Each time, however, I discovered her reasoning was remarkably difficult to challenge. Around lunchtime, we presented our combined recommendations to the executive committee. Questions came rapidly from every direction. One executive worried about international compliance. Another questioned employee retention. A third challenged projected financial outcomes. Without discussing it beforehand, Madison and I naturally divided the conversation. I answered every legal concern while she addressed strategy, communication, and negotiation. By the time the meeting ended, the chief executive officer leaned back in his chair wearing a satisfied smile. "This," he said, looking at both of us, "is exactly why I insisted you work together." Neither of us responded immediately. As we gathered our documents afterward, Madison quietly handed me one of the presentation folders. "Page 42, she said. "I added a contingency plan based on your comments from yesterday." I opened the folder and stopped walking. She had not only listened to my suggestions, she had strengthened them. "You changed the structure," I observed. She nodded. "Your legal framework was solid. I simply adjusted how we present it to the other side." I looked at the revised proposal again. It was better than my original version. Admitting that fact should not have been difficult, yet it felt strangely unfamiliar. "This is excellent work," I finally said. Madison smiled with genuine appreciation rather than triumph. "Thank you. Coming from you, that actually means something." Later that afternoon we remained in the conference room long after everyone else had gone home, refining details for the next negotiation session. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Chicago slowly transformed beneath the glow of thousands of evening lights reflecting across the river. At one point we both reached for the same document lying in the center of the table. Our hands paused only inches apart before we instinctively pulled back at the same time. We exchanged an awkward smile that neither of us tried to explain. "You know," Madison said quietly while organizing the remaining files, "I spent years assuming you saw me as the enemy." I leaned against the table and considered my answer more carefully than expected. "Honestly, I saw you as the one person who never allowed me to become comfortable." She looked at me with thoughtful surprise. "That might be the nicest thing you have ever said to me." Walking back toward the elevators together, I realized something had shifted without either of us noticing the exact moment it happened. We were no longer trying to prove who was smarter. We were beginning to discover what became possible when neither of us had to win every conversation. By the middle of the second week, our calendars had become almost impossible to separate. Every strategy session, executive briefing, and negotiation rehearsal placed Madison and me on the same side of the conference table, something neither of us would have believed only days earlier. We still challenged each other's ideas constantly, but the conversations had changed. Instead of trying to expose weaknesses, we were refining strengths. One Tuesday afternoon, the chief executive officer informed us that the next phase of negotiations would take place at a corporate retreat outside Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, where executives from both companies could work without constant interruptions. The trip would last 3 days. "You will travel together," he announced while reviewing the schedule. Madison looked at me with a smile that was almost amused. "I suppose there is no escaping each other now." I folded the itinerary and slipped it into my briefcase. Apparently not. The drive north took nearly 2 hours, carrying us away from Chicago's skyline toward rolling hills, quiet forests, and peaceful lakeside roads. At first our conversation remained entirely professional. We reviewed negotiation timelines, anticipated difficult questions from shareholders, and debated contingency plans if regulators requested additional concessions. Somewhere after crossing the Wisconsin state line, the subjects gradually shifted without either of us noticing. Madison asked where I had grown up. I admitted I had spent my childhood in a small Illinois town where everyone seemed to know everyone else's business. She laughed and confessed she had grown up outside Minneapolis, dreaming of leaving for a larger city where she could constantly challenge herself. By the time we arrived at the Lakeside Conference Center, I realized we had spoken for almost 2 hours without arguing once. The retreat itself felt surprisingly peaceful compared to downtown Chicago. Large windows overlooked the water, walking paths wound through tall oak trees, and the slower pace seemed to soften even the most demanding executives. During the first afternoon workshop, however, old habits briefly returned. Madison proposed adjusting the negotiation sequence to build trust before discussing financial concessions. My instinct was to oppose the idea immediately. "That approach risks weakening our leverage," I said. She remained perfectly calm. Only if they believe we are negotiating from fear instead of confidence. We debated the strategy for nearly 15 minutes before one of the senior board members interrupted with a smile. You two argue like people solving the same puzzle from opposite sides of the table. The room filled with quiet laughter. Later, after reviewing the discussion more carefully, I realized Madison had been right. Her sequence created more flexibility without sacrificing our legal position. I walked onto the outdoor terrace overlooking the lake where she was standing alone watching the evening sunlight ripple across the water. You won today's argument, I admitted. She turned toward me with genuine surprise. That might be the first time you have ever said those words. I smiled despite myself. Do not get used to it. She laughed, and the sound carried gently across the calm water. We remained there for several quiet moments, neither of us feeling any need to rush back inside. As the sun slowly disappeared beyond the trees, I noticed something I had carefully ignored until then. Madison was not simply intelligent or accomplished. She possessed an uncommon patience that made everyone around her feel heard, even when she disagreed with them completely. It was a quality no resume could ever capture. Walking back toward the conference center beside her, I caught myself looking forward to tomorrow's meetings for reasons that had very little to do with the merger itself, and that realization quietly unsettled me in ways I could no longer dismiss. The second morning at the retreat began with dense fog drifting across Lake Geneva, softening the shoreline until the water and sky seemed to blend into one quiet horizon. I woke earlier than usual, unable to stop thinking about the presentation scheduled for that afternoon. The merger had reached its most delicate stage, and every decision carried consequences for thousands of employees, whose futures depended on people like Madison and me finding common ground. I carried a cup of black coffee onto the outdoor terrace, expecting to be alone, but Madison was already there leaning against the wooden railing with a notebook balanced in one hand. She looked up and smiled. I had a feeling you would be awake before sunrise. I laughed quietly. Old habits are difficult to break. She closed the notebook and joined me near the edge of the terrace where the lake remained hidden beneath layers of pale gray mist. Do you always prepare this much before every negotiation? She asked. I prepare because I dislike surprises, I admitted. What about you? She considered the question for a moment. I prepare because people become unpredictable when they are afraid. If I understand what they fear, I usually understand what they need. Her answer lingered with me long after we returned inside. Throughout the morning, our presentations unfolded almost effortlessly. She anticipated emotional concerns before executives voiced them, while I addressed legal questions with carefully organized precision. By lunchtime, the board members from both companies appeared noticeably more optimistic than they had been only 24 hours earlier. During the afternoon, however, an unexpected complication emerged. Federal regulators requested additional financial disclosures before approving the next phase of the merger, forcing everyone to revise weeks of preparation within only a few hours. Conference rooms filled with hurried conversations as legal teams, accountants, and executives scrambled to reorganize documents. Without saying a word, Madison rolled her chair beside mine, opened her laptop, and began restructuring the negotiation sequence while I rewrote compliance language. Hours passed almost unnoticed. Every time I finished one section, she had already anticipated what I would need next. Every time she adjusted a strategy, I instinctively recognized the legal implications before she explained them. It felt less like two professionals dividing responsibilities, and more like two minds gradually learning the same rhythm. By early evening, the revised proposal was complete. The chief executive officer reviewed the final draft before looking up with visible relief. I honestly do not think anyone else could have finished this today, he said. After everyone else finally left the conference room, Madison stretched her shoulders and smiled wearily. I think we have earned a break. We walked outside as the fog slowly lifted, revealing calm water reflecting the orange glow of the setting sun. Wooden docks extended quietly into the lake, while distant sailboats drifted almost motionless across the peaceful surface. Can I tell you something? Madison asked softly. I nodded. Of course. She looked toward the horizon before speaking. For years I believed you never respected me. Every negotiation felt like I was trying to prove I belonged. In the same room. I stopped walking, Madison, that was never true. She turned toward me with quiet curiosity. I smiled honestly. You intimidated me because you always understood people better than I did. I respected you long before I admitted it, even to myself. She laughed gently, shaking her head. We wasted a remarkable amount of time, assuming the worst about each other. Standing beside the quiet lake beneath the fading light, I realized she was right. The rivalry that had once defined us suddenly felt less important than the trust we were beginning to build. And somewhere beneath that realization was another feeling I still was not ready to name. When we returned to Chicago, the city seemed louder than I remembered. The quiet rhythm of the lake had been replaced by traffic, crowded elevators, and conference rooms filled with overlapping conversations. Yet something fundamental had changed between Madison and me during those 3 days away. We no longer approached meetings from opposite sides of the table. Without discussing it, we instinctively divided responsibilities according to our strengths, finishing each other's ideas before they even needed explanation. Colleagues who had spent years watching us compete began exchanging confused smiles whenever they saw us working together with unexpected ease. I never thought I would witness this, one senior executive joked after another successful strategy session. Madison simply laughed while I pretended not to hear him, though privately I wondered the same thing. By Thursday afternoon, the merger entered another critical review with representatives from both companies gathering for a final series of negotiations. The atmosphere inside the boardroom felt noticeably more optimistic than during our first meeting, but optimism rarely lasted long in corporate law. Halfway through the discussion, one of the opposing executives questioned several financial projections that had already been approved days earlier. The conversation quickly became tense as legal advisors searched through documents while shareholders exchanged increasingly worried looks. I immediately reached for supporting paperwork only to realize one of the revised reports had not been distributed correctly. Before I could respond, Madison calmly stood and addressed the room. She acknowledged the concern without becoming defensive, explained the revised financial structure in language everyone could understand, and redirected the conversation before uncertainty had time to spread. As she spoke, I quietly located the missing documentation and distributed updated copies across the table. By the time the executives finished reviewing them, the concern had disappeared almost as quickly as it had appeared. The chief executive officer glanced toward both of us with unmistakable relief. Later, after the meeting ended successfully, we remained alone inside the nearly empty conference room while evening sunlight reflected across the glass buildings outside. I leaned back in my chair and smiled. You knew exactly what I needed before I asked. Madison closed her notebook and returned the smile. I had a feeling you were already solving the legal problem. Someone simply needed to keep everyone calm long enough for you to do it. I laughed softly. That level of trust usually takes years. She looked at me thoughtfully. Maybe trust grows faster when two people finally stop trying to prove who is better. Her words stayed with me as we left the building together. Instead of heading directly home, we walked several blocks along the Chicago River where restaurants were beginning to fill with people enjoying the warm evening. Office lights reflected across the water while tour boats drifted beneath the bridges carrying visitors through the heart of the city. We paused near the railing, watching the skyline glow beneath the fading sunset. Can I ask you something? Madison said quietly. Why did you become a corporate attorney? I looked toward the moving water before answering. Because I believed every problem had a logical solution, if someone worked hard enough to find it. She smiled gently. Do you still believe that? I thought about the question longer than I expected. Professionally, yes. Personally, I am not so sure anymore. She nodded as though she understood exactly what I meant. We continued, walking without another word. Yet the silence between us no longer felt empty. It carried a quiet sense of understanding that neither contracts nor negotiations could ever create. For the first time since this partnership began, I realized I was no longer measuring success only by whether the merger would survive. Somewhere along the way, another outcome had quietly become just as important, and that realization both comforted and frightened me in equal measure. The merger entered its 5th week, and with every passing day the pressure inside our office intensified. Deadlines multiplied, investors requested additional assurances, and executives who had once questioned our partnership now depended on it completely. Madison and I rarely needed to explain our thoughts anymore. A single glance across the conference table often communicated more than an entire conversation could have only a few weeks earlier. One evening, after another 12-hour workday, we finally left the office long after most of the lights in the building had gone dark. The city outside shimmered beneath thousands of reflections as warm summer air drifted through the streets along the Chicago River. Instead of heading directly toward the parking garage, Madison slowed her pace. "Would you mind walking for a while?" she asked. I looked at the nearly empty sidewalks before smiling. "I think we have earned a few minutes away from conference rooms." We followed the Riverwalk where restaurants were beginning to close and only a handful of people remained enjoying the peaceful evening. The noise of the business district gradually faded until all that remained was the quiet sound of water moving beneath the bridges. For several minutes neither of us spoke. Surprisingly, the silence felt comfortable. "Do you ever wonder how different life might have been if we had met somewhere other than a negotiation?" Madison finally asked. I laughed softly. "Probably much less stressful." She smiled, then looked toward the water. "I almost did not accept this project." That caught my attention. "Why not?" She rested both hands on the railing before answering. "I was exhausted. I had spent years proving myself in rooms where I constantly felt I needed to be stronger than everyone expected. When I heard you would be leading the legal strategy, I assumed the next 6 weeks would become another competition. I understood that feeling better than I wanted to admit. I made the same assumption," I confessed. "I believed working with you would be the most difficult part of this merger." She looked at me with an amused expression. "And now?" I smiled honestly. "Now I cannot imagine completing it without you." She lowered her eyes for a brief moment, and I noticed the quiet emotion she usually kept hidden behind professional confidence. "Can I tell you something I have never shared with anyone at work?" she asked. "Always." She took a slow breath. "My father owned a small manufacturing company. It failed when I was in college. I watched people lose jobs they had depended on for years. That is why I became a negotiator. I wanted to help businesses survive instead of watching families pay the price when they did not." Her words changed the way I saw her completely. Every difficult negotiation, every carefully chosen sentence, every patient conversation had never been about winning. They had always been about protecting people. I found myself sharing something I had rarely admitted aloud. My mother worked as a legal assistant. She taught me that the law should never exist only to prove someone is right. It should exist to give people a fair chance. Madison smiled gently. "Maybe that explains why we work so well together." We remained beside the river watching the city lights dance across the water until the night grew noticeably cooler. As we finally turned toward the parking garage, our hands brushed briefly while walking side by side. Neither of us stepped away immediately. It lasted only a heartbeat before we naturally created space again. Yet that single quiet moment lingered in my thoughts long after I arrived home. Lying awake later that night, I realized the walls we had spent years building against each other had almost completely disappeared. What remained was something far more meaningful, and for the first time I found myself wondering whether the greatest challenge ahead would have nothing to do with the merger at all. The following morning began with clear skies above Chicago, but inside the executive conference center the atmosphere felt unusually tense. We had reached the final negotiation week, and every conversation carried the weight of months of preparation. Madison and I arrived earlier than everyone else, spreading revised agreements across the polished conference table, while the city slowly awakened beyond the towering glass windows. She adjusted several presentation folders before looking toward me with an expression I had learned to recognize over the past few weeks. "You are overthinking something," she said gently. I smiled despite myself. "Am I becoming that predictable?" She laughed softly. "Only to me." Her answer settled into the quiet room with unexpected warmth. Before I could respond, my phone vibrated with an urgent message requesting my immediate attention in another conference room. "I will be back in a few minutes," I told her. "Start reviewing the international compliance section without me." She nodded confidently. "I have it covered." The meeting across the hall lasted much longer than expected. By the time I returned, nearly 40 minutes had passed. Madison was standing near the windows speaking with one of the senior financial consultants, while several executives reviewed updated documents. Everything appeared perfectly ordinary until I noticed the expression on her face. She looked composed, yet there was a distance in her eyes that had not been there earlier. Once the room emptied, I approached her quietly. "Is everything all right?" She hesitated before answering. "Someone mentioned that after the merger closes, you have been offered a partnership position in New York." I blinked in surprise. "Who told you that?" "Does it matter?" she asked softly. "Is it true?" I looked down at the folder still in my hands. "The offer exists." She nodded once, her expression becoming carefully professional. "Congratulations. You earned it." Something about the way she said those words immediately felt wrong. "Madison, I have not accepted anything." She offered a polite smile that never reached her eyes. "You do not need to explain your career decisions to me." Before I could continue, another executive entered the room requesting both of us for the afternoon presentation. The conversation ended before it had truly begun. Throughout the remainder of the day, we worked together with the same efficiency everyone had come to expect, but the effortless connection between us had quietly disappeared. Every exchange became formal. Every sentence sounded carefully measured. During one presentation, I instinctively looked toward her after answering a difficult legal question, expecting the reassuring smile that had become almost routine. Instead, she focused on her notes without meeting my eyes. That absence affected me far more than I wanted to admit. After the meetings concluded, I found her gathering documents into her portfolio. "Madison," I said gently. She stopped but did not turn around immediately. "I never applied for the New York position." She finally faced me. "But they offered it anyway." I nodded honestly. "Yes." She smiled politely, though sadness lingered beneath the expression. "You should take it. Opportunities like that do not come twice." Before I could explain that I had not made any decision because another part of my life had suddenly become impossible to ignore, she thanked me for the day, wished me a pleasant evening, and quietly walked toward the elevator. I remained standing in the empty conference room long after the doors closed behind her, realizing that silence could sometimes create misunderstandings far greater than any argument ever could. For the first time since our partnership began, I understood that the greatest risk was no longer losing the merger. It was losing the one person who had slowly become the first thought I carried into every morning, and the last thought that stayed with me every night. The final week of negotiations should have been our strongest. Instead, it became the quietest. Madison and I still arrived before everyone else, still prepared every presentation together, and still delivered every recommendation with the confidence the board expected, yet something invisible had settled between us. The easy conversations had disappeared, replaced by careful professionalism that felt colder than any disagreement we had shared during our years as rivals. Every time I wanted to explain the truth about New York, another meeting interrupted us before I found the right moment. Every time I convinced myself there would be another opportunity, the distance between us seemed to grow a little wider. On Wednesday morning, only 48 hours before the final board vote, an unexpected crisis disrupted everything. An anonymous email containing confidential merger documents had been sent to several financial journalists overnight. Although none of the information was published, the leak immediately triggered an internal investigation. Executives gathered in emergency meetings while compliance officers reviewed access records and communication logs. The atmosphere that had slowly become hopeful transformed back into suspicion almost instantly. I watched as legal teams examined every digital record connected to the merger. Then one of the investigators quietly approached the chief executive officer and handed him a printed report. I noticed Madison's name near the top of the page before anyone said a single word. According to the preliminary access logs, her employee credentials had been used to open several confidential files only minutes before the anonymous email was sent. A heavy silence filled the conference room. Madison looked genuinely shocked. "That cannot be right," she said calmly. "I was presenting to the finance committee at that exact time." Several executives exchanged uncertain glances. No one openly accused her, yet the questions hanging in the room felt impossible to ignore. I knew Madison well enough by then to recognize absolute sincerity in her voice, but evidence rarely cared about intuition. After the meeting ended, she quietly gathered her portfolio without speaking to anyone. I followed her into the hallway. Madison. She stopped but kept her eyes fixed on the windows overlooking the city. You do not have to say anything, she whispered. I know what this looks like. I stepped closer. I do not believe you did this. She finally looked at me, surprise softening the exhaustion on her face. Even after seeing the report? I nodded without hesitation. The woman I have worked beside for 6 weeks would never risk thousands of jobs for personal gain. For the first time that day, her guarded expression began to weaken. Thank you, she said quietly. That means more than you probably realize. Before either of us could continue, the chief executive officer asked me to join an emergency legal review. The investigation would continue through the night. Hours later, sitting alone in my office surrounded by digital access logs, security reports, and surveillance timelines, one small detail refused to leave my thoughts. The report showed Madison's credentials had been used while she was speaking live before dozens of executives in another conference room. That should have been impossible, unless someone had deliberately used her credentials without her knowledge. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the evidence spread across my desk. The merger was no longer the only thing under threat. Someone had carefully chosen Madison as the perfect person to blame, and for the first time since this partnership began, I understood that protecting her might require risking everything I had spent 20 years building. I remained in my office until well past midnight, surrounded by security logs, access records, and surveillance reports that no longer resembled simple paperwork. Every page seemed determined to tell the same story, yet one detail refused to fit. Madison's employee credentials had accessed confidential merger files at exactly 3:27 in the afternoon. At that precise moment, she had been standing in a conference room presenting financial projections before more than 30 executives. I replayed the recorded presentation twice, checking the timestamps against the digital access records. They matched perfectly. Someone wanted investigators to stop asking questions the moment they saw Madison's name. The following morning, I requested access to the building's security footage, explaining that I needed to verify the legal timeline before the board meeting. After nearly 2 hours of reviewing recordings from different hallways and office entrances, I finally noticed something unusual. A senior technology consultant entered Madison's office carrying a maintenance laptop, less than 10 minutes before the unauthorized file access occurred. At first, nothing seemed suspicious. Then I checked the maintenance schedule. There had been no service requests for her office that entire week. My pulse quickened as I compared additional records. The consultant had borrowed a temporary administrative access device earlier that afternoon, returned it only minutes after the data breach, and immediately left the building claiming a family emergency. The pattern was too precise to ignore. I gathered every document, every timestamp, and every security image before walking directly into the chief executive officer's office. He listened silently while I explained the inconsistencies one by one. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and studied me carefully. You realize what happens if you are wrong, he said quietly. Ido. The board may question your judgment. The merger could be delayed. Your own reputation may suffer. I met his eyes without hesitation. If I ignore evidence because protecting my reputation feels safer, then I do not deserve either. He remained silent for several long seconds before reaching for the investigation file. Very well, he said. Let us find the truth. By late afternoon, the internal investigation confirmed what I had suspected. The consultant had secretly copied Madison's login credentials during a routine software update days earlier, and used them to access restricted files before sending anonymous messages designed to disrupt the merger and manipulate stock prices. Federal authorities were notified, and Madison's name was immediately cleared. News traveled quickly through the executive offices. Some colleagues apologized awkwardly while others simply looked relieved. I searched the building until I found Madison standing alone beside the large windows overlooking the Chicago River, quietly watching the afternoon sunlight reflect across the water. She turned as I approached, uncertainty still lingering in her expression. It is over, I said softly. They found the real person responsible. She closed her eyes for a brief moment before letting out a slow breath she seemed to have been holding all day. I heard. When she looked at me again, gratitude filled her eyes. You believed me before anyone else had proof. I smiled gently. I believed the person I came to know, not the evidence someone wanted me to see. She stepped a little closer, her voice almost a whisper. Do you realize what you risked? I nodded. Yes. Why? For the first time in years, no carefully prepared argument came to mind. I answered with the only truth that mattered. Because losing my reputation would have been easier than losing your trust. She looked at me without speaking, and in the quiet that followed I realized there were some verdicts no courtroom could ever deliver. The most important ones were decided by the choices we made when no outcome was guaranteed, and I knew our story had just reached the moment where neither of us could keep pretending that this partnership was only about business. The following morning the atmosphere inside headquarters felt completely different. News that Madison had been cleared spread through every department before most employees finished their first cup of coffee. Executives who had quietly questioned her integrity only 24 hours earlier now greeted her with relieved smiles and awkward apologies. She accepted each one with remarkable grace, never showing bitterness or resentment. Watching her respond with such quiet dignity reminded me once again why I had trusted her long before the investigation proved I was right. By late afternoon the board gathered for the final vote approving the merger. Months of planning, weeks of negotiations, and countless difficult conversations had all led to a single meeting that lasted less than 40 minutes. When the final signatures were complete, the room erupted into applause. People shook hands, congratulated one another, and celebrated a deal that would protect thousands of jobs across both companies. The chief executive officer raised a glass of sparkling cider and smiled toward Madison and me. This merger succeeded because two extraordinary professionals discovered they were stronger together than apart. Laughter and applause filled the room again, but my attention remained fixed on the woman standing only a few feet away. She looked relieved, happy, and somehow more peaceful than I had ever seen her. After the celebration ended, employees gradually drifted toward nearby restaurants while reporters waited downstairs for official statements. Madison quietly slipped out onto the rooftop terrace overlooking the Chicago skyline. I found her standing near the edge, watching the golden light of sunset reflect across the river and the glass towers surrounding us. Escaping the celebration? I asked softly. She smiled without turning around. Only for a few minutes. I needed some quiet after everything. I joined her beside the railing. The warm evening breeze carried the distant sounds of traffic far below, while the city slowly settled into another summer night. I have been thinking about something, she said after a long silence. All these years I believed our rivalry existed because we were too different. I looked toward the horizon before answering. Now I think it existed because we were more alike than either of us wanted to admit. She laughed gently. That sounds like something a lawyer would say. Is that a compliment? It is. We stood together for another quiet moment before she faced me completely. Her blue eyes held the same honesty I had come to trust over the past 6 weeks. Harper, when you defended me yesterday, something changed for me. My heartbeat quickened though I remained silent. She continued softly. I realized I stopped thinking of you as my rival a long time ago. Somewhere between the long meetings, the late nights, and all those conversations by the river, you became the person I looked for every morning. I felt every carefully constructed wall inside me disappear. You were not the only one, I admitted. I kept convincing myself these feelings were only gratitude or respect. They are not. A gentle smile appeared across her face. Then what are they? I let out a slow breath, surprised by how simple the truth finally sounded. They are the reason I turned down the New York partnership this morning. Her eyes widened with genuine surprise. You declined it? I nodded. Because I finally understood that success without the right people beside you stops feeling like success. She looked at me for several quiet seconds before her smile became brighter than any celebration inside the building. Neither of us rushed to fill the silence because, for the first time since we met across that conference table weeks earlier, nothing important remained hidden between us. We had won the merger, restored trust, and discovered something neither contract nor competition had ever prepared us to find. And as the last sunlight disappeared beyond the skyline, I knew our greatest decision still waited just beyond this quiet moment. The celebration faded into memory over the next several days, but the quiet certainty I had found on that rooftop remained. For the first time in years, I no longer measured my future by promotions, corner offices, or prestigious titles. Instead, I found myself looking forward to ordinary moments I had once overlooked. A shared cup of coffee before work. Conversations that wandered beyond contracts and deadlines. The simple comfort of knowing Madison would be somewhere nearby. On Monday morning, however, another unexpected change arrived. Madison knocked gently on my office door carrying a single envelope. Her smile was warm, but there was uncertainty behind it. "Do you have a minute?" she asked. "Always." She stepped inside and placed the envelope on my desk. It contained an official offer from a multinational consulting firm headquartered in Seattle. They wanted her to lead a new international negotiation division, a position she had dreamed about for years. "They called yesterday," she said quietly. I never applied. They approached me after the merger. I looked at the letter before meeting her eyes again. "It is an incredible opportunity." She nodded, though she did not sound excited. "Everyone keeps telling me that." A long silence settled between us. Finally, she laughed softly. "Life has an interesting sense of humor. A few weeks ago I would have accepted this without thinking. Now I cannot stop wondering what I would be leaving behind." Her words stayed with me long after she returned to her office. That afternoon I walked along the Chicago River alone, watching tour boats drift beneath the bridges while people hurried home after another workday. I thought about the New York partnership I had declined and the sacrifices both of us had already made. Loving someone should never require asking them to abandon the dreams that shaped who they were. When I returned to headquarters, I found Madison standing beside the large windows overlooking the skyline, the same place where we had spent countless evenings discussing strategy. "I have been looking for you," she said. I smiled gently. I needed a little time to think. She searched my face, almost afraid of the answer. "If Seattle is where your next chapter begins," I said quietly, "then I want you to go." She looked genuinely surprised. "After everything?" I nodded. "Because I love the woman you are, not the city you happen to work in. I never want my presence to become the reason you stop chasing your dreams." Tears shimmered softly in her blue eyes as she stepped a little closer. "Do you know why I have not accepted the offer?" I slowly shook my head. "Because for the first time in my career, I finally found someone who makes every success feel worth sharing." We stood there in the quiet glow of the late afternoon sunlight without speaking for several moments. The silence carried no uncertainty anymore, only honesty. Madison smiled through her emotion before reaching into her portfolio and pulling out another document. I asked whether the position could be based remotely from Chicago for most of the year. My eyes widened. They agreed. She nodded with a bright, hopeful smile. "They said results matter more than zip codes." I laughed with unmistakable relief. In that moment I realized neither of us had needed to choose between love and ambition. We simply needed the courage to imagine a future that allowed room for both. Standing beside the windows where our rivalry had slowly transformed into trust, I understood that the strongest partnerships were never built on sacrifice alone. They were built on two people believing each other deserved every opportunity life could offer, and choosing to walk toward that future together. Several months passed more quickly than either of us expected. The merger became a case study discussed in business schools, the investigation faded into history, and our calendars slowly adjusted to a life that no longer revolved around proving ourselves to anyone. Madison traveled regularly to Seattle, leading international negotiations with the same calm confidence that had always impressed me, while I continued building my legal practice in Chicago. Some weeks we shared the same city. Other weeks we relied on evening phone calls, early morning flights, and the comforting certainty that distance no longer measured the strength of a relationship. Every time one of us returned home, it felt less like arriving at an address, and more like returning to the person who had quietly become the safest place in our lives. One crisp autumn afternoon, several months after the merger officially closed, Madison suggested we revisit the rooftop terrace where everything had changed. The skyline looked almost identical to the evening we had stood there after the final board vote, yet somehow both of us had changed completely. The wind carried the familiar sounds of the city below while golden sunlight reflected across the Chicago River between rows of glass towers. We leaned against the railing side by side, watching office workers hurry home exactly as they had countless times before. Do you remember the first morning we met in that boardroom? Madison asked with a smile. I laughed quietly. I remember thinking you were going to become the most difficult person I would ever work with. She raised an amused eyebrow. Only work with? I smiled and shook my head. I also remember deciding within the first 5 minutes that you were impossible. She laughed so warmly that several nearby visitors turned toward us with curious smiles before continuing on their way. After the laughter faded, a comfortable silence settled between us. You know what surprises me the most? I asked softly. Madison looked at me with quiet curiosity. For years I believed every important victory came from defeating the person standing across the table. Then I met you and discovered the greatest victories happen when someone chooses to stand beside you instead. She reached gently for my hand, her fingers fitting naturally into mine as though they had always belonged there. I spent years trying to outsmart you, she admitted. I never imagined the happiest moment of my life would come from finally lowering my guard. I looked toward the skyline before answering. Maybe we were never really competing against each other. She smiled. Then who were we competing against? I thought for a moment before replying. The fear that trusting someone would make us weaker. She nodded slowly, understanding every word without needing another explanation. As the sun began disappearing beyond the buildings, painting the sky in warm shades of gold and amber, I realized our story had never truly been about winning negotiations, protecting reputations, or completing the largest merger of our careers. Those events had simply created the path that allowed two stubborn women to discover they were far stronger together than they had ever been apart. We turned away from the skyline and began walking toward the elevator without rushing, knowing there were no deadlines waiting for us anymore. The future remained uncertain in all the ordinary ways life always is, filled with new projects, unexpected challenges, and countless decisions still waiting to be made. Yet none of that frightened me now. Somewhere between rivalry and respect, between late-night strategy sessions and quiet walks beside the river, we had discovered something neither of us had been searching for when this journey began. The greatest partnership of our lives was never written into a contract, approved in a boardroom, or celebrated in a business headline. It was built one honest conversation at a time, until two former rivals quietly realized they had already become each other's home.